Actually, it's just that. That's all that it is. It's really just a weight and a string. Kind of simple. But that's the beauty of it. There's a man who often gets referred to as one of the greatest portrait painters of all time. He's known for being able to capture the model in the simplest, most elegant way possible with these thick, juicy brush strokes. A lot of you probably already know who I'm talking about, but if you don't, that's okay too, because this is just the tip of the iceberg. John Singer Sargent. That's a name you won't forget. And he wasn't born this way either. He was just a normal kid sketching like this, probably similar to what you do in the margins of your notebook in math class. It's pretty easy to get the idea that some artists are just born naturally talented, but that's nonsense. They went to school, specifically the École des Beaux-Arts, or the French Academy of Fine Arts. An English artist in the 19th century expressed a very common sentiment that you'd hear at the time. It was then to be generally regarded as the truth that it was necessary to go to Paris to learn painting. 20 years ago, we began to tire of the naivety, the quaintness, and the simplicity of our English drawing, because it did not measure so correctly with the model as that done in the Beaux-Arts. People were flocking from around the world to go to Paris and learn how to paint, just like John Singer Sargent did to go from this to this. Now let me bring a heavy hitter into the scene, Jean-Léon Gérôme. Gérôme is the French Academy in many ways. There's almost no teacher more prolific than him. During his time teaching at the École, more than 2,000 students passed through his training. I've really come to appreciate the simplicity of these paintings. Each of these colors is mixed to be absolutely perfect, with incredible accuracy. He just hits the right choice on the first try. It's the simplest, rawest form of skill, and as I grow as a painter more and more, I fall more in love with Gérôme's work. But we're here to talk about his draftsmanship, because this painting stuff is nonsense without the structural framework underneath it. That is, drawing. Students were not allowed to touch the paintbrush until they became highly competent in the art of drawing. And that Gérôme's students were. You might recognize the names of his students, like Bridgman or Thomas Eakins, Mary Cassatt, Julian Alden Weir, and many, many more. This was some of the best painting education that ever existed, at least when these guys weren't stripping down the newbies and making them sword fight with paints, but that's a story for another time. We gotta get back on track here. Now, something interesting came across my desk the other day. Let me read this out for you. Another story is of when Gérôme, who asked a young American if he used a plumb line when he drew. The American replied, oh no, that he didn't need one, whereupon Gérôme replied that the American student might be able to draw without one, but he couldn't. Now, these 19th century guys, they didn't need to lean on a lot of tools, and Gérôme is one of the best draftsmen or drawers in the world, and he liked this plumb line. I think we need to look more into this. Henri Matisse. If you've taken an art history class, you probably know that name, and you've definitely seen this painting before. But it might surprise you to know that Bouguereau, one of the most technically skilled and academic painters of all time, was his teacher. Matisse recounts his time studying with Bouguereau here. At the first lesson, Bouguereau made a great fuss about the fact that I wiped my charcoal with my fingers, and my figure wasn't properly placed on the paper. In the studios, if the figure was too high, it's called a pendu, or a hanged man. Finally, he told me to do a few drawings of plaster casts, and talked about academic composition, which was the same everywhere. Use a plumb line. Here we go again with this plumb line thing. I mean, what is a plumb line? What are these guys yapping about? Am I right, Gen Z? Well, I gave it my best shot. One of the best descriptions of drawing education from this time is this handbook meant for students, Drawing in Conte and Crayon by Frank Fowler. And right inside this book, we'll find this, the plumb line. Another most valuable adjunct in drawing from life and from the cast is the plumb line. This consists of a piece of strong twine with a weight on one end, which serves to keep the string perfectly straight and steady when suspended from the hand. A straight line is thus simulated, which is dropped from a given point to one directly underneath. So a plumb line is just a weight tied to a piece of string, and when you drop it, it goes down because of gravity and stuff. In this painting, we'll drop the plumb line from the head and find that it lines up with the side of the shoe. Let's go back to that George Moore quote that we started with. Here he describes the general academic process used in Paris. We were told to count the number of heads and to mark them off on our paper. Then with the plumb line, we were shown to determine the sway of the figure. It drops through the ear, the right breast, the hip bone passing, let us say through the heel. The leading measurements and general lines being thus obtained, note was taken how much the body fell to the left or to the right of our plumb line, and we were instructed to sketch in, drawing by masses of light. This was the secret forgotten sauce of the 19th century academic process. You use your thumb and your pencil to count the number of head heights and mark those on your page. Next, check with your plumb line a few areas of the body. The most helpful one, depending on the pose, is generally the pit of the neck. On a standard contrapposto pose, this line goes from the pit of the neck through the pit of the crotch and hits the inside of the weight-bearing ankle. This takes time, and it's surprisingly confusing when you first try to learn it, but spending however much time this takes, be it 10 minutes, 20 minutes, will save you hours of fixing mistakes or just the frustration of having unsolvable errors late in your process. Now, this Frank Fowler guy that wrote this drawing handbook, he went to the French Academy of Fine Art too. I mean, of course. He studied not with Jerome, though, with the other top workshop, which was by a man named Cabanel, the fallen angel guy. I know that this is starting to get a little bit confusing, so I can just do some crazy editing right now, okay? At nighttime, after studying with Cabanel, Fowler would go study with Adolphe Yvon, the drawing teacher at the Academy, who also wrote a book on drawing, and here we'll find this. The foundation of this teaching will be an intimate knowledge of the principal geometric figures, such as the vertical line, the horizontal, and the oblique at all angles, the circle, the oval, etc. All forms are nothing but a succession of these figures. We have to be really careful with taking advice, especially when it seems so clear, because what was clear in the 19th century can be completely misinterpreted today, and the next line gives us a much clearer picture of that. However, it would be dangerous to push to excess the reduction of forms, and especially human forms, to geometric shapes. The difficulty of such operations are likely to repel rather than help students in their studies. Let's wrap this up with why I brought up Sargent in the first place. Sargent might be considered one of the best, but it wasn't because of his perfect accuracy, which is actually something Sargent struggled with a lot. He routinely had to restart his paintings over and over again. He was the best at capturing the character of the model. Patmore, who had his portrait painted by Sargent, said, "He seems to me to be the greatest." But Patmore looked like this. Sargent had brought out a deeper character of the model, while also capturing his likeness. Realist art isn't just about photo accuracy. That's very important, and the plumb line helps us a lot. But it's also about something much deeper, something that a photo can't capture. Now make sure you don't take me too literally on that one either. I got one final quote from our friend Sargent. "Never be without a plumb line in your left hand." It's painting time. I just upgraded to the deluxe artist storage cart with this incredible acrylic surface to mix paint on top of. The bigger your palette can be, the better, and it makes it so much more enjoyable for you all to watch along. Big thanks to Medine for sending me this cart and sponsoring this video. And they've actually added in something for you guys too. Purchases made using my link below will receive 12% off of their purchase, and for the next 2 weeks will be entered to win one of 5 of these 24 color oil paint sets. Come on in, I want to take y'all through my drawers. First up, look at these smooth pull-out, nice walnut finished drawers. I got a whole bunch of paints I've collected over the years. It just keeps going. I fit as many as I could in there. Same thing down here. These are the brushes that I use most often. I got some more, but these are the ones that I actually go for, and all my brush cleaning supplies as well as my mysterious goop. Next up, there's my rag drawer. And right down here, I got all my chemicals and mixtures and potion making supplies. I got a whole bunch of them, but Medine's got plenty of room for me. You guys all know I love to try quality alternatives to the super expensive art brands, and for that reason I've always wanted to try Medine. They've really exceeded my expectations with this storage cart. It's very high quality and sturdy. I can't make content or sit down to paint without at least trying to organize my life a little bit in order to have a clear mind, and this is a massive help. It's also just a beautiful piece of furniture that's going to be a staple in the studio. And that attention to detail is apparent in all of their furniture, like their heavy-duty artist easels, which can tilt flat like a table and is on smooth casters for easy movement around your studio. They also offer all sorts of art supplies for a very fair price, like their tabletop easels for those of you with limited space, and of course oil paints, brushes, and many art sets. If you've been thinking about getting some upgrades for the studio or restocking on some supplies, consider checking out the link below. There's a huge range of supplies, and it's a big help for the channel. I'll be using Medine's titanium white in my painting today. While we finish out this drawing, we need to remember Yvonne's advice. Of course, we need to think about our construction, our big masses, and how these pieces of the body fit into each other, but it's subordinate to the flow of the entire figure. Nobody wants to see your boxes, and you'll seldom find a head that looks like a box, or a rib cage that looks like a box. They're great tools, but when do we let the tools define what our artwork looks like? I like to think about building out a basic mannequin, like a sack of flour, or a noodle man, or one of these guys. Big, simple masses that wrap around the figure and make it flow like water. I might have lied to you when I said that was the end of the history. There's one more bit of this George Moore quote that I just am obsessed with. We became infected about the time I speak of with a desire of construction. That is, the mapping of the figure into so many dioramic shapes, some to be filled with light, some with shadow. We began then dimly to understand that the figure should be built up, that is, to draw by the character, as we had hitherto been content to do, was but the infancy of art, whereas to draw by the masses was its manhood and apotheosis. Moore is saying here is that, yeah, of course you need construction. Everyone needs construction. It's a very important thing to make your figure feel 3D, but that's just its infancy. That's the baby stage, because nobody wants to see all that construction. That's not what a human looks like. You need to think about the character, just like Sargent, because this is the education that Sargent got too. Don't let your techniques become your art. Things not to do in a room with no ventilation. Yeah, I got a few different things on my palette here, so I'll run you through it real quick. I'm using this solvent-free gel here, and that just is my replacement for like mineral spirits or turpentine or whatever. I just like to experiment around with new stuff, and I've been liking that lately. We got the standard titanium white and ivory black. We got burnt umber, yellow ochre, and ultramarine blue, but none of this stuff really matters all that much. It just is vaguely the colors that I see on this guy, which is really just tan, so we don't need much at all. Now, my goal here isn't to create a perfect master copy. The author of this painting, Meissonier, is known for painting every highlight on each button of a coat. There's a time and a place for that, but it's certainly not right now. The strength of the Plumb Line is the strength of all 19th century art. We live in a world where everything is needlessly complex and procedural. Oftentimes, when people look back to describe the techniques of the masters of the past, they start and end with systems and procedures, without ever stopping to ask themselves, is that the same way that the masters thought about it? What you'll find in the 19th century is a resounding no. Materials are just the means to the end. They have to be good enough to function. In the 19th century, you do about 95% of your painting with hog bristle brushes, and then maybe 5% or so with softer sable brushes to finish it out. And you'd avoid badger or camel hair brushes for being overly soft and cheap quality. Nowadays, you walk into a store and you have to contend with 30 different brands. Instead of spending your time painting with whatever medium quality brushes you get, you spend hours reading and obsessing over different brush types and qualities. This infestation trickles down into everything that we do. When we look at history, it's not enough just to take it for face value. We have to understand the context that it sits in. We go to the 19th century looking for secrets to their incredible realism, but all we find is the plumb line, a piece of string with a weight on it. Then how do you get so good? They didn't have more energy than you. If you start eating raw beef and organic butter every morning, you won't have any more strength than they did. They took the same amount of human energy that everyone has and used it on something that's more important. That's it. It's always going to be wholly unsatisfying, but also a bit beautiful in its simplicity. You can tell me that everything these guys touched was gold, and they didn't make mistakes or bad sketches. And you're right. They didn't make bad sketches, but they sure did make some ugly ones. Because where you might hold yourself back for hours perfecting a sketch until it's perfect, they might have done several sketches, each focusing on something that's more fundamentally important. You must understand that there's a counterbalance to everything that I say. There is a time and a place for perfectly finished art. There is a time and a place to care about perfect accuracy, to measure everything, to construct every box, but to do it without considering the entirety of the painting, the figure inside the borders of the canvas, the brush in your hand,
and the painter trying to create the art they always dreamed of. That would be a mistake. So there is a time and a place for everything in your studies. And my worst fear is that people will hear me talk and leave with the idea that nothing matters. You should just do whatever you want. And that's something impossibly difficult to wrap your head around about the 19th century. It stands on a razor's edge between the previous 18th century academics who systematized everything and the 20th century modernists whose mission it was to end the rule of the academy. This type of thinking, it can't last long because it's inherently transient. But that's what made the art of the time so beautiful and so human. Let me balance all this talk out with something tangible. Just as I simplified our figure down in my drawing to a flowing noodle, I'll now need to simplify it down with my paint into general color groups. The most important thing is to mix your paint until there is an exact match in color. A proper video on the horrific overcomplication of color theory, which is something that I consider to be one of the easier mechanical tasks of painting, probably needs to be made at some point. But we don't have time for that today. This is, however, where simplifying the figure into boxes or forms is very important. But it can easily be implied here without needing to square everything off or to lose yourself in the construction or perspective. Look for the largest masses of colors and shades. When it turns from a lighter color to a darker color, ask yourself, why? If something gets dark, it's because it moves away from the light. If it gets dark really quick, it ran around a corner. And if it gets dark very gradually, it's casually strolled towards the other side of the form. Our light is a describer of what is happening. If we only treat it in the broadest generalities possible, then there is no chance of the tiny details stealing the show from us. That's the greatest risk in any painting. Getting too sucked into the intricate folds of the clothing, only to stand back and realize you've completely missed the color or value all along. So what is the solution to all of this? Don't try to play the game better. Simply don't participate in that game at all. You're not that guy. You're probably not going to nail all the colors and values on the first try. So play to the strengths of the materials that you have. Oil paint is one of the most flexible and forgiving mediums that there is, contrary to the popular belief that it's difficult and convoluted. As long as the paint we put down is thicker than what's underneath it, we can overpower it. Now, you should still put down your paint relatively thick, even in the early stages, because paint needs to be paint. Don't try to fight the materials you have. Oil paint shines when it's thick enough to flow smoothly. Build out your general masses of light and color following the form and value changes. If you need the form to be more gradual and less box-like, add another value to soften it. Just don't add too many or work too quickly. Solve the problems that you have with the most limited tool set you can. Then, once you can't do any more, you give yourself another value. Once the whole of everything reads accurately, you can dive deeper into the details. Simply put, you break things down into large primary forms, then secondary forms, and then tertiary forms, the small details at the end. I don't care about the folds on this guy's clothes until the very end. And this doesn't just apply to an old white guy in this very particular clothing. This applies to everything. This is just painting, it's just design, so it even applies to abstract work. While I didn't give this painting a Meissonier level of time, I'm still very pleased with the effect I got in only about 90 minutes. Because I ignored every bone in my body screaming at me to add the details. Just as you should ignore every bone in your body telling you to keep looking for that new technique or that next tool that will make you better at painting.